On the super review, let's take a look at this beat up box. It's got a pair of Sennheiser IE40 Pro in-ear monitors inside. So a lot of the earphones that I review on this channel, you could put into a category called Chi-Fi. And the whole appeal of Chi-Fi is that you are spending relatively less amount of money to get an earphone that sounds like a more expensive name brand product. Well, here we've got a name brand product, and I'm kind of interested to see how does this thing sound versus a similarly priced Chi-Fi item. So this is the Sennheiser IE40 Pro, and from what I can tell, this is actually a monitor that is aimed at professionals with a relatively, actually very neutral looking sound signature and a fairly utilitarian build. And these things aren't especially cheap, but they're also not especially expensive. These things are around $100 right now on Amazon. And for $100, you get a single dynamic driver earphone that I think it looks pretty handsome, but pretty basic. And I'm gonna use this as an opportunity to also get acquainted with another $100 IEM that's sort of a name brand, which is the Shure SE215. And what I wanna do in this review is see how does this IE40 Pro compare to that other $100 name brand earphone. But I also wanna see how does it compare to $100 Chi-Fi. And frankly, right now, my king at the $100 price range is the Rode Mini Mark II, which is just a very enjoyable listen. Will I be able to say the same thing about the IE40 Pro? Let's find out. All right, let's talk about the Sennheiser IE40 Pro. Like I said I was gonna do, I spent a lot of time listening to it, but I also spent specifically some time comparing this thing directly to the Shure SE215. They're both $100 IEMs that I think are targeted at sort of like the professional sound market. And just to be clear, I am not a professional sound engineer by any stretch of the imagination. I make silly YouTube videos, but I do like listening to music, and we can talk about how these things are to listen to music with. But before we get into comparisons, I'm just gonna start by talking about just the Sennheiser, and we'll start by talking about the build of this thing, which, you know, you can see it. It's a fairly nice looking earphone, and it's pretty cool to see just how far you can go with something this simple. It's not the best build quality. I would say that build quality wise, these are probably about on par with like $50 Chi-Fi, but it's not bad. I don't really have any complaints about it. Well, I got a couple of complaints and we'll get into it, but mostly I'm pretty happy with the build and the aesthetic of the Sennheiser. I think that, again, it's a simple look, but it fits really, really well in my ears. I like this general design for an in-ear monitor. I find that they fit really well, they're secure, they create pretty decent isolation, and it's really not fussy to fit. So that much I appreciate. The only real downside of sort of the build of the buds is that there are some sharp edges on the plastic that over time can become a little bit uncomfortable. At least that's what I found. Just kind of like on the outside, inside of my ear, if that doesn't make any sense, but that's what I'm gonna stick with. The outside, inside of my ear will start to get a little bit of fatigue from those sharp plastic edges. Not a big deal, but for me at least, it did limit my long-term enjoyment with this earphone. The cable that it comes with is a fairly basic, just rubber or silicone cable. You know, it's not like a braided cable like you would get on a lot of similarly priced Chi-Fi, but I don't find that that's actually a problem. I think that as far as silicone cables or whatever you want to call this type of cable go, this is one of the best. It's actually, it behaves really well. It has zero memory, right? When you coil this thing up and uncoil it, it just lies perfectly flat. It doesn't fight you when you want to coil it. And that's kind of all I really want out of an earphone cable, frankly. It might not look the prettiest or the flashiest, but I think it's perfectly well behaved. My only real issues with the cable come up here, where you got memory wires in them. And as far as memory wires go, I actually like these better than like the memory wire that you would get in an older KZ cable. But I still do personally prefer to have preformed ear hooks versus wires. It's just because as I fit these things on and off, I tend to stretch the wire back out, and I have to spend a lot of time reshaping the wire to fit my ear every time I put them on. So for that, I don't prefer the wire, but it's not the worst wire. The other small complaint up here, maybe it's a bigger complaint, but I don't know. It's just these connectors are not MMCX connectors. They are, I think, a proprietary Sennheiser connector. Maybe there's something else out there that uses this connector, and maybe it is possible to get replacement cables from somewhere other than Sennheiser, but it's just kind of a bummer. I feel like it's a missed opportunity. If you're gonna make an earphone like this with replaceable cables, you might as well use a connector that's pretty universal. So, I don't know, small complaint there, I suppose, because otherwise the connector is fine. It does allow the earphones to swivel, and it's a nice secure connection, and it is at least replaceable in some way. And then when we get to talking about the sound of the Sennheiser IE40 Pro, I think that, like, tonality wise, these things are just about bang on perfect. I'm pretty happy with the general tonality of this earphone, which is actually a fairly flat sound signature. The bass is pretty elevated, so I definitely couldn't actually call it a flat sound signature. The bass is elevated. If you like a nice thumpy bass, I think you'll like it here, and it doesn't sound especially boomy or anything like that. I think it's pretty well done. The mid-range is nice and flat. There's a little bit of an upper mid-range lift, but not much. The part of the sound signature, though, that I think has the most emphasis is the lower treble region, where there's not even so much a lot of emphasis, there's just a lot of it. The treble doesn't sound spiky at all, right? So the lower treble regions where you would get, you know, issues like sibilance, I don't really have any issues with sibilance on this earphone at all. It's just that it sounds like there's a lot of treble. So where, you know, in some earphones you might have a spike in the treble and then a drop off. This is just kind of like a mohawk, where it's just constant. Rather than a ponytail where you get a spike, this is a mohawk treble. I think that's going to become a thing that people say from now on, is mohawk treble. I'm just kidding. No one's ever going to say that except for me, but that's kind of how I would describe the treble. Is it just feels very full, not spiky, but very full, and it can be pretty fatiguing because of that. The stock tips that this thing comes with, so it comes with some silicone tips and some foam tips, which is pretty typical. But what's not totally typical is that those tips have little wads of foam in them, both the silicone tips and the foam tips. As well, actually, the earphone nozzles have little wads of foam. So I think that they knew that this was a pretty treble hot earphone and they were trying to tame it with those little wads of foam, but they don't quite get there. I do think that the stock foam tips help a little bit to tame the treble versus the silicone, but they don't do a ton. But what I've got on here now are a pair of Comply tips that have got the wax guard built into them. And that, I think that these are actually doing a lot better job of taming that treble. It's still a pretty hot treble, but it's just a lot less fatiguing with these tips on it. And I don't think that they steal away from the detail or anything like that. I think that these just make these the best sounding that I can get them. So I describe them as kind of flat with elevated bass and slightly elevated treble, just hot treble. So overall, I think you could probably describe it as a bit of a U sound. The mid-range is just, it's not sunken, and the mid-range is not, it's not missing at all. The mid-range is very present and very flat. So that's why I would describe it as sort of a flat, even though it's got, you know, that bass and treble emphasis there. The sound staging on this earphone is not especially strong. I don't think it's bad, but it's not especially strong. It's just kind of a wall of sound versus a lot of bespoke instruments. And because it's that wall of sound with that hot treble, again, it can be a fairly fatiguing earphone, but I think that tonality-wise, it's pretty pleasant to listen to. With the right music, this is a pretty nice sounding earphone, but with the wrong music, and by the wrong music, I just mean music that's fairly flatly recorded or very treble hot, it can be either kind of boring or just a bit much. And so now I can do some comparisons here with the Shure SE215. And I'll start just with some of the build comparisons. I think that the Shure is a more comfortable earphone. It's a little bit smaller. The buds, I mean, the fit-wise is actually pretty similar, but I think that these things are just a little bit smaller and they don't have those rough edges around the plastic, at least not that I feel inside my ear. Isolation may be also a little bit better on the Shures, but overall, they're both pretty good. I think that the bigger difference in the build is this cable. So the Shure SE215 does have an MMCX cable, which I prefer, but everything else about this cable I kind of hate. I don't know, can you see like just how kind of nasty and ratty this thing is? It's super stiff. It feels like it's been sitting out in the sun for a long time or something. I don't know. It just feels like the whole thing is moldable, which you don't really want. And the ear hooks up here are a memory wire, just like the memory wire on the Sennheisers. Again, not the worst memory wire, not as bad as KZ memory wire, but not my favorite. Just build-wise, it's mostly let down by this cable. If you put on a different cable, and you can because it's MMCX, I think that I would prefer the build of this thing. I don't think it looks as nice as the Sennheisers, but I think that it just fits nicer. But sound-wise, I definitely prefer the sound of the Sennheisers. These things actually seem a little bit more colored in the sound signature than I expected for something that is ostensibly made for monitoring audio production. These are, I would say, a warmer sound signature to them, which is maybe a little bit boomier in the bass, a little bit fuller in the lower mid-range. And then the upper mid-range, or just like the middle mid-range, has got a bit of a dip in it. And I think that it kind of has the effect of making these feel a little bit congested. I mean, I think overall tonality-wise, these things they're pretty good. And it's a decent listen. The treble here, I should actually call out, is a lot less hot than it is in the Sennheisers. In fact, it's maybe a little bit too relaxed here. I think that these miss a little bit of detail, and I think that contributes to some of that sensation of warmth. I don't think that this is the most engaging listen, but it's definitely a more comfortable and relaxing listen, if that makes sense. Which one's actually better for producing audio, like monitoring audio? I would guess that the Sennheisers are, but again, I just make silly YouTube videos, so what do I know? But when you're looking strictly just at listening to music, I would take the Sennheisers. So out of 5 stars, I'd give the Sennheiser IE40 Pro, I think 3 stars. I'm on the verge of giving it 4, but I'll stick with 3. I think that sound signature wise, I actually like these quite a bit. I think that tonality, they're strong.
The treble's a bit hot and fatiguing, but if you can add a pair of Comply tips to these things, they do become a very pleasant and pretty comfortable listen. They just don't come with Comply tips out of the box. You know, it's not my favorite sound in this price range. That would still definitely go to the Rode Mini 2 Mark II, which I recently reviewed. But it is, I think, a pretty nice sounding earphone. Mostly the 3 stars rather than giving it 4 is gonna come down to the build, which, again, I think this thing looks pretty nice and it's fairly comfortable to listen to or fairly comfortable to wear. It's just some of those edges in the plastic and the fact that it's not MMCX kind of let it down. It's on the verge of 4 stars. I definitely wouldn't say you shouldn't get this earphone, but if you're looking at this thing, I would know what you're getting. If you're interested in checking out the Sennheiser IE40 Pro, or if you're interested in checking out shirts like this, there are links down below. And while you're down there, you can hit the like button for the video if you liked it. You can subscribe to the channel, and then I'll see you on the next super review.